Hey you guys, welcome back to the salon. So, back around Halloween of 2021, I made a video over on my Flickers of Fear series. Like I did a series around Halloween called Eek Week, and I did a video on Something Wicked This Way Comes, the 1983 movie adaptation of the classic Ray Bradbury novel. And this movie was what was part of what's sometimes termed Disney's dark phase. This period in the studio's history has always really fascinated me because in spite of the financial failure that most of these movies suffered when they were released, almost all of the movies that came out during this era are pretty fondly remembered by kids who saw them at a, formidable age and have thus developed like a really strong cult following among adults nowadays who grew up in that generation. So, for those who are unaware, prior to the 1970s, the film production arm of Disney was very strictly kid-focused. I mean, all movies that were released by the studio absolutely had to have a G rating, no question about it, and they had to be as innocent and inoffensive as it was possible for them to be. So, I mean, obviously this strategy had worked very well for them in the past, but once the 70s got rolling, things started to change in a lot of different ways. For one thing, both Walt Disney and Roy Disney were both dead by 1974, and there was a whole lot of uncertainty among the board members at Disney as to the direction that they wanted the studio to take going forward. And for another thing, even though the animated Disney movies that came out during the 1970s, like most notably Robin Hood and The Rescuers, did just fine box office wise, the studio's live action movies were pretty consistently disappointing at the box office. So some of the executives noticed that the movie-going culture was going through some pretty radical transformations. I mean, Jaws came out in 1975, that ushered in the whole era of the summer blockbuster, and the cultural phenomenon of Star Wars, which Disney initially turned down, much to their later chagrin, appeared just 2 years after that, and everybody kind of knows what a huge impact that made. So a few of the higher-ups at Disney realized that they were losing out on a massive potential audience by not releasing films that appealed to teenagers and young adults rather than just real little kids. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't some controversy among the ranks. I do kind of feel like some members of the higher ups, of management and stuff, were sort of appalled at the very idea of making movies that were targeted toward an older demographic because they thought that it would essentially tarnish the very wholesome brand reputation that Disney had spent so many decades building up. But in the end, the faction who actually wanted to radically stir shit up won the day, and thus began a very weird, intriguing chapter in the chronicles of the House of Mouse. And like I said, this is one that has always been really interesting to me. So leading the charge into this new era was The Black Hole, which was released in late 1979, and it was itself a milestone for Disney because it was the first movie that had been released by the Disney Studios to have a PG rating, which was a huge big deal for them because, like I said, everything very strictly had to be G prior to this. Now, although the movie was, of course, attempting to cash in on the science fiction craze that was initiated by the unbelievable success of Star Wars, the project that would eventually become The Black Hole had actually been kicked around, been in consideration since the mid-1970s. Now, I actually remember seeing The Black Hole in the theater as a kid, and I even had the vinyl soundtrack album with the little pull-out posters and stuff. Though I have to say that the movie didn't make a huge impression on 7-year-old me. That's how old I was when I saw it. I was more a horror and ghost story person than a sci-fi person, even back then, even when I was a little kid. I will say, though, that iconic shot of that massive fireball, barreling through the shaft, toward our heroes, terrified the shit out of me, and stuck with me for many years after that, and in fact was probably the only thing that I remembered from it. Rewatching the movie a few years back for a video review that we did several years ago over on our movie retrospectives, I realized how insane it was that this was actually made by Disney. I mean, it's very dark. It's essentially like a gothic haunted house story, set in space, and even has some pretty horrific kills in it and images that were pretty shocking for the time period and for the intended audience, I guess. So, although The Black Hole didn't do as well financially as the studio executives had hoped that it would, they decided they were going to continue to press on in this new direction, and they actually did keep it going for several years, probably until like the mid to late 1980s, when they went into like their Renaissance period with movies like Aladdin and The Little Mermaid and things like that. So the 1980s saw the release of several like scary or just plain like weird or bizarre kind of live action movies that have subsequently haunted the nightmares of youngsters everywhere, at least youngsters of my age. 1981, you had Dragon Slayer, which was actually like a co-release with Paramount. 1982's Tron, which wasn't like scary, but it was like pretty weird and like surreal. The aforementioned Something Wicked This Way Comes, which I mentioned earlier. And perhaps most traumatizingly, 1985's Return to Oz, which I will definitely do a post and video about like one of these days, because that's one that a lot of people bring up. I mean, even their animated movies during this time period shaded a little bit darker, particularly the release of 1984's The Black Cauldron. But one movie from Disney's dark phase that pretty continually gets brought up in discussions of ostensibly kids movies that just basically frighten the piss out of my generation, or like people my age, is the 1980 film The Watcher in the Woods. Now, I don't remember seeing this movie back in the day for some reason, which is kind of a strange fact in itself, because something like this would have been right up my alley at 8 years old, which is how old I was when the movie came out. I think that I did read the 1976 novel by Florence Engel Randall that it was based on, but I've forgotten pretty much everything about it. But because so many people in like my age cohort, I guess, have mentioned this movie, so I felt like I had to finally sit down with it and see kind of what all the fuss was about. So this was actually, I was surprised to discover, it was actually directed by John Howe, which I think is how you pronounce his last name, who not only directed a bunch of stuff, but he not only directed the 1971 Hammer film, Twins of Evil, which we talked about over on the other channel, but was also in the director's chair for one of the best haunted house movies ever made, 1973's The Legend of Hell House, which of course was based on the excellent novel Hell House by Richard Matheson. Now, The Watcher in the Woods had an extremely troubled production history, like that's putting it mildly. So, upon initially purchasing the rights to the source novel, the producer apparently pitched it to Disney. He wanted the movie to have kind of like the same cultural impact and cachet, maybe, as The Exorcist, but filtered through Disney's sensibilities, I'm guessing. Like, he's basically like, I want this to be our Exorcist. That's like how he pitched it. Now, the first screen treatment that was written of Watcher in the Woods, which differed somewhat from the book, particularly in the ending, was deemed way too dark for Disney, even in this new direction they were going, and the script was subsequently rewritten a number of times. So the movie was rushed into a limited release in April of 1980, in order to coincide with the 50th anniversary of Bette Davis's acting career, because she had a significant role in the film. Now, although the initial plan was to roll out the movie into more markets over the next couple of months, which is usually what you did back then, there was such a harsh negative reaction from both critics and audiences that Disney actually ended up pulling the movie from theaters after only about 10 days, and then basically spent like the next year and a half cycling through just endless rewrites and reshoots. They even brought in a different director, the uncredited Vincent Macavity. I'm not really sure how you pronounce his last name. He mainly worked in TV, but he had directed like several previous live action films for Disney, which included like The Apple Dumpling Gang Rides Again, Herbie Goes to Monte Carlo, Herbie Goes Bananas, like stuff like that. So when the retooled movie appeared in theaters again in October of 1981, most critics, I feel like, were a little bit more charitable, but even to this day, reception of the film is pretty mixed, and audiences at the time were kind of lukewarm about it too. The movie ended up pulling in only about $5 million domestically upon the re-release. The main issue, it seemed, that most people had with it was the ending, which in the original universally reviled cut that was released in spring of 1980, pretty much, like, I kind of feel like critics and audiences thought that the ending, like, just seemed tonally out of left field and incomprehensible. And in later cuts, like after it was re-released, was kind of seen as, well, more coherent, but still kind of batshit crazy and maybe clunkily explained, let's put it that way. Now, to be fair, the ending of the book was also kind of what the fuck. So you can't really blame like the multiple screenwriters' attempts to translate this what the fuckery to the screen in a way that would make sense within the context of the story, I guess. So the narrative of The Watcher in the Woods follows the Curtises, who are an American family who've moved to England temporarily, I guess, while the dad, Paul, who's played by David McCallum, probably most famous for being in The Man from U.N.C.L.E., is composing music for like a big stage production or an opera or something like that. Now, the book, I will note, is set entirely in the United States, specifically in Massachusetts. And in the book, the family's last name is Carstairs, not Curtis. And the dad is actually a college professor and not a music composer. But, you know, these alterations don't really make a big difference, like in terms of how the story plays out or anything like that. The manor house in the movie that the family are renting, by the way, is played in the film by St. Hubert's Manor in Buckinghamshire, which was used in a couple films from the 1960s and several episodes of the British TV series The Professionals, but has now been converted into like an apartment building and a community center, as far as I could determine. Also, though, I wanted to note that one of the characters in the film lives in the very grand house known as Eddington Park in Warwickshire, which is where one of my favorite films of all time, Robert Wise's classic 1963 movie, The Haunting, was shot. So the rest of the family consists of the mom, whose name is Helen, and she's played by Carol Baker, who was actually started out being in Giant with James Dean, and she went on, eventually she would star in a handful of like Umberto Lenzi's 1970s giallo films, including Knife of Ice. And there's two daughters, the younger Ellie, who's played by Kyle Richards, who was also in Escape to Witch Mountain, which was also directed by John Howe, and Halloween, the original John Carpenter one. She actually later starred on The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, which I've actually never seen, and she recently reprised her role as Lindsay Wallace from the original Halloween in both 2021's Halloween Kills and 2022's Halloween Ends, so there's that. And the older sister is named Jan, and she's played by figure skater Lynn Holly Johnson. Now, she actually won a Golden Globe Award for her performance as a blind figure skater in the 1978 movie Ice Castles, and she was also in the 1981 James Bond film For Your Eyes Only. So Betty Davis plays a woman named Mrs. Aylwood, and she's the owner of this estate that they're coming to rent. And she's actually like moved to the smaller guest house on the property while renting out the larger house for a very reasonable price to the right people, which, you know, sounds very similar to the setup of 1976's Burnt Offerings, which also had Betty Davis in it, so there's that. So the old woman kind of initially seems a tad creepy and a little bit standoffish, and in particular, she seems fixated on the teenage girl Jan for some reason, but she basically comes to the conclusion, she's like, okay, well, the Curtis family, you guys are okay, you guys are worthy of staying in the house, so the move goes ahead as planned. Right from the start, though, as is typical in these types of movies, there seems to be mysterious doings afoot. Now, not only are there kind of like threatening POV shots peering at the daughters from amongst the foliage, which, you know, not surprising considering that the movie is called The Watcher in the Woods. So, you know, you need somebody watching from the woods. There you go. But while she's looking out her bedroom window into the surrounding trees one afternoon, Jan sees what appear to be kind of strange flashes of blue light. Now, as the story goes on, she also sees other kind of like anomalous lights here and there, usually in the form of rings or circles or triangles, and eventually she begins to see what seems to be an apparition of a blonde girl wearing a blindfold who actually looks a lot like her, appearing in mirrors and like in the ruined local chapel. Now, her younger sister Ellie is kind of experiencing some weirdness too. After adopting a very, very cute puppy from a nearby farm, and oh my God, I hadn't seen this movie before and I had forgotten about the book. So when I first saw the puppy introduced, like my stomach clenched like that. I'm like, oh my God, nothing bad better happen to that little puppy. Oh my God, because I thought something terrible was going to happen. But turns out, like, spoiler alert, he's fine. Thank goodness. Nothing bad happens to the dog. So you can watch it safely. So she adopts this dog from the farm, the younger daughter does. after that, like, she goes, they ask what she's going to name it, and she's like, I don't know. I don't know him yet, so I got to think of a name. But then she kind of goes into this weird sort of like fugue, and she writes Nerak, Nerak, like in the dust on the barn window, and she decides to name the dog that, like, inexplicably. But little does she realize that on the other side of the window is the very clearly written name Karen, because obviously Nerak is that spelled backwards, which causes the woman who owns the farm, whose name is Mary, to freak out when she sees it. Ellie, by the way, also starts saying a bunch of weird shit in her sleep. So one day, the puppy tears ass into the woods. Ellie has to run after him, and then Jan notices that they're both gone, and she's like, holy shit, so she has to follow into the woods after them as well. Now, she comes across a pond and sees another one of those bizarre blue rings, and it's sort of like, I don't know if it kind of like hypnotizes her or something, but it kind of like causes her to fall in. And then there's like a pretty creepy scene, and I think this was one scene that a lot of people like pointed out that it scared them, and I get it, like it is pretty creepy, where she's basically like down in the pond and she looks up through the surface of the water. She can't get out, and it looks like Mrs. Aylwood, Betty Davis, is shoving Jan down into the water with a branch, like she's trying to drown her. But after that goes on, like for a very harrowing like few moments, it turns out that Jan was just like caught on some limbs in the pond, and Mrs. Aylwood was actually trying to use the branch to like pry her out and save her life. So she does like pry her out. She saves her from drowning. So afterward, both Ellie and Jan are recovering at Mrs. Aylwood's guest house, and Mrs. Aylwood tells them that Karen was actually the name of her daughter who disappeared many years ago. So after Jan tells her about this apparition that she's been seeing, the old woman basically confirms, yeah, that's Karen. And then she tells Jan that on the night that Karen went missing, she was playing some sort of game, like with 3 of her friends in the old chapel. But while they were all in there doing what they were doing, lightning struck the steeple, and the place like pretty much like partially burned down and like kind of collapsed. So everybody either assumed that Karen had been killed in the fire, but her body was never found, or, sometimes they're like, oh, maybe she ran away because they never found her body. But everyone's just kind of assuming that she died in the fire because that's what it seemed like. So Jan is now convinced that Karen's ghost is trying to tell her something or ask her for help or something like that. So Jan starts kind of conducting her own investigation into what's going on. So the 3 friends who were there like a long time ago when Karen disappeared, the aforementioned Mary, who lives at the farm, a local hermit guy named Tom, and an aristocrat type guy named John, all still live in the area. Although most of them are kind of reluctant to talk about the night that Karen vanished, John in particular is pretty hostile toward Jan's questions. At this point in the story, I will say, you would be forgiven for thinking that the 3 friends had maybe killed Karen, like either accidentally or on purpose, and then hid the body to avoid getting in trouble. Indeed, that is what I thought was going on. Though I admit that I was surprised that if that had been what was going on, like I was surprised that the movie revealed the mystery so early. But oh boy, is that really not what's going on. So Jan she gets more like visions and more weird messages from Ellie, who kind of seems like she's going in and out of trances and things like that. And Jan figures out that whatever it is she's supposed to do, like to help Karen, it has to take place during this upcoming solar eclipse, which everybody's making a big deal about. Now, after talking to the somewhat mentally challenged Tom, like one of the friends, but like they're grown up because this was like 30 years ago, she discovers that the friends actually saw Karen disappear, like into thin air, not just we were there and then we turned around, she was gone. They saw her disappear before the church's bell like fell onto the spot where she'd been standing. Jan also learns that before this happened, that they were all doing some sort of like initiation ceremony, like that's why she had the blindfold on, but it doesn't really appear that it was anything like nefarious or occult or satanic or nothing like that. It was just like some kids like playing at having a secret society, kind of revolving around their friendship, and they were just doing this little ritual like to induct her into their little friend circle or whatever. So from the ambiguous clues coming to her from the great beyond, you're led to believe, Jan deduces that she's supposed to get John, Mary, and Tom to come to the chapel during the solar eclipse and recreate the initiation ceremony with Jan standing in as Karen, because like I said, she kind of like resembles her, right? She apparently believes that this will bring Karen back from wherever it is that she disappeared to. Now, the 3 friends are pretty reluctant to do this at first because they're not really sure what will happen, but they finally agree to go through with it. And as the whole scenario is playing out, the apparently possessed Ellie comes into the chapel and sort of like lays out some exposition about what in the absolute blue fuck is going on, thankfully, like for the benefit of the audience. See, what happened, I think, is that 30 years ago, there was some kind of alien or interdimensional being who was hanging out in this area for some reason. And because of the specific incantations or circumstances surrounding the original initiation ceremony that the kids were doing, which also took place during a solar eclipse, this being was inexplicably switched with Karen. So the alien, or whatever it is, has been lurking around the periphery of the film, watching from the woods, title drop, while Karen has been trapped in the alien's dimension, which is like outside of time and space or something like that. So like the three friends and Jan are doing the ceremony, and at first it looks like they've made a terrible mistake because a bunch of windows break and it's like there's a supernatural wind blowing from everywhere, and it looks like Jan is actually getting sucked up into some brightly lit vortex, just like Karen presumably did all that time ago. But then Jan's kind of boyfriend, Mike, who is also Mary's son, plows onto the scene and breaks up the friendship circle because they're doing the whole, you know, don't break the circle, like holding their hands or whatever. And he does that, like, I guess, just as the eclipse is ending. So this alien being, the Watcher, then leaves Ellie's body, which it was possessing, and it kind of just looks like this sort of shaft of, like, blobular kind of light. And then it turns out, like, Jan and the three friends are fine, and Karen is returned to our dimension, and she's like the same age as she was when she left, and she still has the blindfold on and everything. And then Betty Davis comes in and she's like, oh my god, it's Karen, and they hug, and that's the end. Now, according to Wikipedia, the film's original ending would have had the Watcher actually appear as a demonic alien creature that, at least according to the stills, looked pretty horrifying and badass. The Watcher would have then like snatched Jan and took her to like its world, like its dimension, and then like stick her in a prism, like jail cell or something for that. I don't know. And then, but then after that, like she'd get freed and Karen would get freed. And then when they get back, like Jan explains that the alien needed her in order to free Karen. But I don't get, like, had they done that original ending, like, I don't really get like why both girls got to leave, because to me it would make more sense if the two girls had to be exchanged, like one for the other. But, you know, whatever. They didn't do that ending. Now, the ending that was shown during the disastrous initial release, the one that so affronted the test audiences and critics, did have the monster in it. Like, the monster showed up and took Jan away, but it took out the whole traveling to alien dimension and putting her, like, imprisoning her in a prism type of thing due to the effects not being finished. And it only still had like a partial explanation, like Jan partially explaining like what was going on with the Watcher after her and Karen like kind of get back safe and sound, like, you know, beaming down on a beam of light or whatever. And most people, audiences, critics, everybody like that, found this ending completely baffling. Like, they thought like it made no sense at all, which I totally get. Like I said, I haven't seen it, but the way that it's described, I'm just like, yeah, I have no idea what the fuck. I would have had no idea what the fuck was happening either. Now, the ending that's on the official release, the one I just described like a few minutes ago, still isn't great, but at least made some sort of sense. I mean, at least in a, well, okay then, kind of way. You know what I mean? I still don't really understand the mechanics of the girls being exchanged, though. I mean, I get that the alien, or whatever it was initially switched with Karen accidentally because of, like, the specific parameters surrounding the eclipse and the ceremony and all that. And I get that the same circumstances would have to be recreated, like, in order for the transfer between the dimensions to occur, like opening up the interdimensional door or whatever. But I was operating under the assumption that the Watcher wanted to return to its own dimension because it was trapped here, just like Karen was trapped in its dimension. You know what I mean? And if that was the case, then why did it appear as though the Watcher was trying to take Jan away and was only stopped when Mike intervened and, like, disrupted the ceremony by pulling everyone's hands apart? Like, was the Watcher going to keep Jan for some reason? And if so, why? Because like I said, Karen was taken accidentally. So I don't understand like why they would want, because I didn't think like the Watcher was an evil being. I just thought the whole thing was like a mix-up or like an accident, and the whole switch just had to happen like on the next solar eclipse because that was the first time that it could have happened. I mean, as I mentioned, this, you know, if the Watcher had been trying to take Jan, which it clearly was, like that scenario would have made more sense if the Watcher had first taken Karen on purpose, like was evil, and then wanted maybe Jan to like replace her or something. I mean, that still doesn't make much sense either, but it's a little bit less bewildering than whatever the explanation is that is given here. Now, in the book, I will note, Karen originally disappeared into an interdimensional vortex in the woods rather than from a chapel, which actually kind of makes more sense from thematic standpoint. And I don't even think like the whole initiation ceremony was a thing. Like, I don't think that had anything to do with her disappearing. The Watcher also in the book wasn't a monster. It actually kind of appeared as like an angelic little girl type of figure. I've also gathered from reviews of the book that the ending was super anticlimactic. Like apparently Jan, Ellie, and Mrs. Aylwood do a ceremony type thing in order to open the interdimensional door in the woods back up. But then apparently like the three of them just wander off into the woods and you never find out what happened to them, like their fate isn't revealed. I guess the book ending the way it did is what made it so difficult to kind of like stick the landing on the film, like why it took like 150 rewrites or whatever, some ridiculous amount, like before they could figure it out. I mean, to be honest, I would be intrigued to see what they would have done with the more demonic Watcher concept, where it was actually like a villain. And interestingly, like I said, reading a lot of the reviews of the book, which like I said, I did read when I was a kid, but I don't remember hardly anything about it. This does seem to be one of the very few cases where most people seem to prefer the movie to the book. I saw a number of reviews of the book saying that the film was actually like much scarier. And while the ending of the movie was kind of odd and sort of confusing still, that it at least had an ending, like unlike the book, which just kind of left shit hanging. I mean, I actually enjoyed this film quite a bit too. It did have some really eerie moments, so I can totally see why this would have really scared somebody who saw it as a kid. It probably would have scared me as well. I will admit that I wasn't a huge fan of taking what was a very effectively creepy little gothic mystery ghost story type thing and taking kind of a hard right turn into Bizarro Land like at the end. But the book kind of did that too, although in its defense, I felt like the book was actually trying to be along the lines of like Madeleine L'Engle's like A Wrinkle in Time, so it's not all that weird in context. And I mean, you can't really blame the screenwriters for trying to like adapt this to the film and like not really knowing like what angle to approach it from. I gotta say too, and I hate to say this kind of thing, but I also didn't love Lynn Holly Johnson in the role of Jan. Her acting was a little bit strange, a little wooden, sometimes like overacting, sometimes underacting. It was just like real uneven. I remember seeing Ice Castles as a kid, and I don't remember her standing out as being particularly bad in that, and she did get a Golden Globe, so I mean, so I don't really know what the case was here, like why her acting was so strange. Overall though, I mean, this was a spooky enough experience, though I have to say I would have liked if more of it had been shot at night. Like I think that would have made it scarier because a lot of it takes place in the daytime, and I kind of wish the demonic Watcher creature had been utilized in the ending, though with a much clearer explanation of what its goals and its abilities and its powers were. Because I mean, I didn't see it moving around. They said that one of the reasons they didn't use the monster ending, other than Disney executives being like absolutely not, was that when the monster looked really, really cool, like in the pictures, but when it was moving, it didn't really look all that good. Like it moved like really puppety and they just weren't into it. So that was kind of one of the reasons they abandoned the idea. But I mean, I can't say that I have a nostalgic fondness for this movie because I didn't see it when I was a child, but I can totally see why a lot of people do. And I mean, it has some really unsettling imagery that would have been very, very shocking for a Disney film of the time. And this is definitely one of those movies that had I seen it as a kid, this would have definitely like made a huge impression. Incidentally, a remake was made for the Lifetime TV network in 2017, and it was actually directed by Melissa Joan Hart of Clarissa Explains It All fame, and starring Angelica Houston as Mrs. Aylwood. Now, although I haven't seen it, it does appear that it follows the plot of the 1980 movie rather than the book pretty closely, but apparently, according to the reviews, has kind of a more satisfying or coherent ending, and has like better acting than the original, like higher caliber of actors, I guess. Though it does seem like most most critics seem to have found it just kind of like mediocre overall. It also seems to have added a pretty weird backstory for the watcher, which is kind of more on the monster-y end of things rather than the kind of cheap shaft of light end of things. I mean, I might watch it one of these days just out of simple curiosity, but from what I could gather, it's still not all that scary and not all that faithful to the source novel, so who knows, I'll get around to it maybe. So that will do it for this installment of The Salon. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Please let me know your thoughts about The Watcher in the Woods, either the book or the movie, in the comments. And I will see you guys again on the next one. Bye.